A lot of people assume that recording drums is a super expensive venture, and in order to get a good drum sound, you need a massive budget. We want to show you that that isn't the case, and how we recorded our first single, You Lost, on a super tight budget and got it sounding as good as it does. We want to tell you how you can do exactly the same. Welcome to the floor of a pirate studio somewhere in Dalston. If you're watching this video, you probably already know how to mic up a bass drum, but I'm going to show you how I personally mic'd up my bass drum for You Lost. It's pretty simple. I literally just stick the mic in the centre of my kick port about an inch away from the head, and I then literally just point the mic ever so slightly towards the centre of the head on the batter side, like where the beater is impacting the head, just to give the actual bass drum a bit more clarity and sort of click in the sound. So yeah, there you go. So with the overheads, what we did, as we only had one overhead, we've put the overhead sort of bang in between the ride and the crash here. We did that because we're actually going to use this not only as an overhead, we're going to use it as a mic for this tom. We're going to EQ it specifically, so it's picking up this frequency range, so we can have a sort of close mic sound from this tom. It doesn't sort of sound like it would work, but we'll show you in Logic. It'll make a lot of sense there. I really don't want to tell you about the snare. Like, everyone mics a snare up pretty much in the same way. There's not too many ways to get miking a snare up wrong. As long as you don't mic up the shell or the stand, you should be okay. I guess we've mic'd it up slightly more pointing towards the centre of the snare just to pick up a few more ghost notes and stuff, because I love myself some ghost notes. But other than that, just whack a mic on your snare and like sort it out later, really. That's terrible advice, don't listen to me. You now join me at the low end of my kit, where we have the floor tom and my big fat snare, or snom, whatever you want to call it. And for miking up this, the purposes of this video, we've actually used one mic, because on one of our tracks, the OG, which you'll be hearing very shortly, we actually only used one mic because we only had enough inputs to record 4 mics on the kit, so we had to share a mic between these two toms, which is probably a relatively niche problem to have. Not many people have a snare and a floor tom here, but this works really for anything if you've got 2 drums next to each other that are roughly the same sort of tuning. So 2 toms, a low snare and a tom, whatever you want to do. We just stick the mic right in between the 2, and then once we go into Logic later when we're editing it, we'll split it into 2 channels, and we'll mix one for the snare, one for the tom, but we'll show you all that later when we go back to Logic. So, last and probably least, we have the crunch mic. We just use this to get sort of a bit more grit in the sound, a bit more nastiness, you know, because we wanted the drums to be nasty for this. All you're going to need for a crunch mic is a microphone. As you can see, this one's of fantastic quality. It looks like an ice cream that someone's really passionately licked, you know, like probably the crapper the mic, the better, because we want it to sound crap, we want it to sound crunchy and nasty. You also want a bag, right? What we're going to do is we're going to get the XLR, because obviously we need an XLR, because a mic without an XLR is pretty pointless. Now drop the mic in the bag. I think on the track we used a snare case, but we're going to use a camera case today because it's all the same. This just sort of muffles the sound a bit more, just to make it sound even weirder. And then once it's all in there like that, you just sort of want to chuck over there, and then you're sorted.
So this isn't really an in-depth mixing tutorial, it's just kind of a brief overview of how we process the stems to get the best out of the mics that we had. So really, what we kind of started with, once we'd kind of organised the stems and put them into a bus, was we wanted to try and create a wider sound for the listener. However, we only had the one overhead mic. So to kind of get around that, what I did was create a second overhead channel and just mix them ever so slightly differently. So you can kind of hear that here. if I just play the mix with one overhead, and they were panned as well, slightly differently, so if I put that into mono, so that's with just one overhead mic. And then if I put in the second mic and pan it back, if you had headphones, you could probably already hear that started to sound a little bit wider, even without putting on the mix. So then if we put on the EQ that we used, you can already say, it's very subtle, but in the context of the overall mix, it adds a huge amount of depth. The next steps really were to mix the tracks. As I say, this isn't a mixing tutorial. We really just started with the lowest pitched instruments first when initially mixing the drums, because the drums was the first thing that we started with, and worked our way up to the overheads. So that's just the bass drum on its own. Then we added in the snare. Now the toms don't come up through the entire song, so we kind of left those to a little bit later. And then we added in the overheads. And the very last thing we added in was this crunch mic, just to give it a very slight amount of saturation. So you can kind of hear already that's sounding quite deep as a sound, it's sounding quite wide. The next thing that we kind of did was process the overall mix, so that comes into the bus here. So once we'd mixed the individual elements, we then went for just the overarching sound, and again this is very subtle, a light amount of compression, a high pass filter just to get rid of the low end, a little bit of saturation, and a tiny bit of EQ. And that's really it, to be fair. There wasn't really a lot more than that. We just wanted to get the best out of the mics that we had in the context of the overall mix.
Like I said in the studio, once you've got your sort of single mic on the two drums, when you're putting it into Logic, create two channels, and then you can EQ them both separately, specifically for those instruments each. That will give you the sound of having both drums mic'd when actually you only had one mic.
Yeah, so another tip I would say is always constantly be going back to the drums when mixing. That really helped me with this. So once we mixed the bass, I then went back, adjusted the drums, and we kind of followed that through the entire track, just to kind of mix the overall thing as we went to make sure it was all balanced. If you want to check out any of the equipment that we used throughout the video, there's going to be links in the description below.
And just remember, the gear isn't the important part. It doesn't matter what gear you've got, just experiment and find out what works for you. If you guys want to check out the finished product of this track, then the new single, You Lost, is on all streaming platforms now. It'd be great if you checked it out. Peace.
Yeah.
Cool.